Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is William van Wagenen, who's here today to talk about the so-called Syrian civil war, the origins of the war leading up to today with HTS, what's kind of going on with Israel, and all the players who are involved in that. He's recently written a book called Creative Chaos: Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government. So thanks for being on today, William. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So, just actually a quick question before we get to the actual meat on the bones. How come you decided to write a book specifically about Syria? How did you get into kind of this one? 'Cause I mean, there's so many wars to choose from with the US. You can go back to the Cold War, but in modern times, the Iraq War, Afghanistan. So, what was it that led you to start talking about Syria? And I know before we start recording, you mentioned it wasn't one maybe at a time or before that you quite thought you'd get into. So how did you get onto this road of getting so heavily involved with the Syrian war?
Well, I've been watching and studying things in the Middle East, the wars in the Middle East for a long time. I first went to Palestine to study Arabic in the West Bank way back in 2003 during the Second Intifada. And while I was there, the U.S., so while I was in Palestine, of course, I saw the evils of the Israeli occupation and the terrible things that the Israeli army does to the Palestinians. And then, while I was there, the U.S. invaded Iraq. And so I had, my attention turned in a big way to Iraq after that as well. And I went to Iraq in 2005 to work for a small human rights NGO and lived in Baghdad during the middle of the sectarian war there when things were really bad. So I had always had an interest in the Middle East going back to 2003. And when the Syria war broke out, years later in 2011, I didn't know too much about Syria. And so, I just kind of followed the news, and like you read in the headlines in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the Telegraph, there was the narrative that there were these grassroots demonstrations, protests against a dictator, and that the people of Syria, were fighting to get rid of the dictatorship and have a democratic government like we allegedly have, in the U.S. or there in the U.K. So, my background, I was for a long time an anarchist. I was a left-wing anarchist. And so that narrative made a lot of sense to me. Oh, they're protesters and they're fighting against this, peacefully against this evil government. So that's what I thought was going on. And then, as I studied the situation more closely, I started to notice a lot of contradictions, and that narrative pretty much fell apart. So in the course of noticing some things, it just motivated me to start writing about the war, to kind of cut through the propaganda. And a major part of it was that I kept reading that as these extremist Islamic groups started showing their face in the Syria war, like the Al-Qaida affiliated Jabhat al-Nursra, led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who just took power a year ago, which we'll talk more about. But other Islamic groups, Ahrar al-Sham, Sukur al-Sham from Idlib, Kataib al-Faruq from Homs, and even the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army was promoted as this defected army officers who were also fighting for freedom and democracy. But when I looked at the Free Syrian Army and then also all of these other groups that were fighting against the Syrian government, I realized that they were Islamist groups or Salafist groups that were very sectarian. They weren't advocating democracy. They were pushing to establish an Islamic state, and they were pushing to massacre and murder the religious minorities in Syria. But everything you read, in the newspapers was saying that it was actually Assad and the Syrian government who had created like the Nusra Front. and the Al-Qaida groups, that Assad had led a bunch of these Islamist militants out of prison in Sednaya to create these Islamic groups on purpose in order to discredit the peaceful democratic protesters or to discredit the democratic Free Syrian Army. And as I looked at it more and more, I could see that that was propaganda. In fact, it was the United States and its allies, Qatar, Turkey, and actually Israel. These were the people that were funding these Islamic groups, and they were using these Islamic groups to basically destroy Syria and divide the country, to basically punish Syria for having an anti-Israel foreign policy. So once those contradictions and a lot of that, I was able to see through that propaganda and see more clearly what was going on. That's what motivated me to start writing specifically about the Syria war. And I started writing really lengthy and detailed articles for Scott Horton at the Libertarian Institute. He was very gracious to publish my work. And, from there, after years of writing and studying about it, I realized, hey, I should compile this all into a book so that it becomes clear and all the evidence is really in one place. And I finished the book, just a few months before all the events happened last December, when this operation led by the U.S., which the CIA referred to as Operation Timber Sycamore, to topple the Assad's government. When that finally succeeded and brought the former Al-Qaida leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, to power in Damascus in December, that was just happened shortly after I finished the book. And at the time, I was just in Beirut here because of the war between Hezbollah and Israel. And anyway, so it took me a few more months to finally get the book out, but now it's there. And so it tells that story about how the U.S., Israel, and their allies basically partnered with Al-Qaida, funded and created these Al-Qaida groups in Syria in order to topple Assad. And again, that operation was finally successful as of last year.
Yes, it's an interesting story, because when you maybe speak to people about it before, people would probably deny it, say that's crazy, considering what happened on 9/11 and all the other terrorist attacks through the years. And then there might be some evidence, okay, well, we're sending weapons to the Free Syrian Army and it's ending up in Al-Qaeda's hands and ISIS and all this. And then now, like with HTS fully taking over, all you have to do is just say to someone, just look up who the leader is and look at his history and who he is and where he's been in prison and why he was in the Middle East and Iraq fighting against the British and Americans. So it is quite surreal to actually, for it all to come to fruition. And Trump's met him, shaking hands. He's now done a speech at the UN in New York. It's all bizarre. World Economic Forum as well. It's just bizarre to see it all happening. So you mentioned a few things there. There's obviously lots of players in this war with, you've the US, Turkey, Qatar, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, other countries involved like the UK, France, Jordan, whoever it may be, in different roles. And then, you've mentioned about that, the grassroots of, these protests. There's lots of different factors here, but I mean, there's lots of evidence to show throughout the years and in your book that the US has been wanting regime change in Syria for a long time due to their relationship with Russia, and then also the Israel angle with Iran and the weapons coming through to Hezbollah. So, but Tony Blair in the early 2000s, they brought Assad over for a state visit with the Queen at the time, which a lot of people don't know, to try and bring him in kind of to the Western side. It didn't work. So, I mean, how long and what was the main motivation for the US and other countries that they wanted Assad gone and utilize these protests? I mean, I'm sure you can argue as well that they weren't natural, the Arab Spring protests, parts of it. So what's the kind of real story here?
Well, yeah, I think it goes back primarily to Israeli interests. The plans, as I detail in the book, the plans to overthrow the Syrian government began shortly after 9/11. I mean, there was this famous incident where Wesley Clark, the former head of NATO, was told by another general in the Pentagon shortly after 9/11 that Donald Rumsfeld and, led by the Jewish neoconservatives in the Bush administration, that they had a plan to topple 7 governments in 5 years. And of course, that started with Afghanistan. The second target was Iraq, which they talked about invading literally one day after 9/11. Paul Wolfowitz in a meeting at the White House, if I remember right, he immediately brought up the possibility of invading Iraq literally the day after 9/11. And so this was
Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaida?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me." Couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. You know, in 2001 he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991 he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a 1-star general. I was commanding the National Training Center. I had met him one time. He said, "If you ever get to Washington, come look me up." They always say that. Well, I was there in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd visited Colin Powell. He'd given me 5 minutes of his precious time and sent me on my way, and I was bored in the Pentagon, and I thought, I'll just go, who can I see? I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there, he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, "Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm." And he said, "Well, yeah," he said, but not really. He said, "Because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't." And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, "But one thing we did learn," he said, "we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us." He said, "And we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us." And it was like, you know, I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I've been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this?
All these Arab governments, in the region near Israel in order to ensure Israel's dominance. And Syria was on that list of 7 countries to be toppled in 5 years. And so the planning started really then, and it picked up in 2005, shortly after Rafiq Hariri was assassinated here in Beirut, which it looks like the Israelis were responsible for. And, the neoconservatives in the Bush administration, they started making plans. They started, on the one hand, training activists from the Arab world, not just from Syria, but also from Tunisia, from Egypt, from Iran, in order to try to spark protests in all these different countries that had anti-Israeli foreign policies. And so that was part of the preparation, train these activists in technologies like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and very importantly, Tor, which allows people to bypass internet censorship in order to use these other social media tools to try to organize protests and destabilize enemy governments. So that was part of the preparation. And then secondly, the US was preparing and Israel were preparing these Al-Qaida militants. Obviously, Al-Qaida was strong in Iraq. It later became known as the Islamic State of Iraq, and that's where, again, Abu Muhammad al-Julani had been fighting since probably 2003. And he and many other members of the Islamic State ended up in the prisons, in the US prisons in Iraq, most notably in Buqa prison in Basra. And there, they were basically trained by the US. They were deliberately released from prison in like 2009 and 2010. And then they were sent to Syria in order to destabilize the Assad government. So it was a combination. It was a dual strategy of having, trying to spark these protests using these more secular activists, although many of them were actually from the Muslim Brotherhood. They kind of gave off the appearance of being secular, but many of them were from the Muslim Brotherhood, and many, including, based in Europe.
When you say
but then on the other hand, they were sending Al-Qaeda militants from Iraq and then also from Lebanon into Syria in order to attack Syrian security forces under the cover of those protests and create the chaos that was needed to kind of get the ball rolling. Sorry to cut you off there. What was the question?
You mentioned that the US deliberately let out these terrorists. So, people might hear that and go, well, they let out al-Julani and Baghdadi and whoever else out of these prisons because, they started to draw down from Iraq, or they was handing it over to the Iraqi security service. Are you saying this was a deliberate plan to let out these specific terrorists to go to Syria? Was it that thought out, or was it they let them out? And, because I guess with the Syrian war, there's the different arguments of we utilized Al-Qaida during the war because there was a stronger fighting force. Are you saying that it was more thought out than that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I argue in the book. All of the evidence is in the book if people want to know the specifics of why I say that the U.S. deliberately let these guys out of prison, including Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who became the leader of ISIS. And of course, Julani, the president of Syria now, was his deputy and was sent to Syria by Baghdadi. I guess you have to just read the book to see all the evidence laid out. And but again, the U.S. relationship and the Israeli relationship with Al-Qaeda goes back way before that. This wasn't the first time that they were working with Al-Qaeda. And maybe that seems weird, especially for people who grew up during the Iraq War, because they saw Al-Qaeda militants in Iraq allegedly fighting against the U.S. occupation soldiers. So there was, in most people's mind, it was kind of cemented that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was, and its original founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, that they were enemies of the U.S. But there's a lot of evidence that actually Al-Qaeda in Iraq was working for the US, and that the job of Al-Qaeda during the Iraq years, like from 2003 up until, the US withdrew in 2011, was to create a sectarian war that would help divide Iraq into different ethnic regions, Kurdistan in the north, and then Sunni Anbar in the west, and then the Shia south and central. And if you like, I could give kind of history of Al-Qaeda in Iraq to kind of help people understand that. I mean, the main thing to understand is that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was really created by the Kurds, by Masoud Barzani and his Kurdistan Democratic Party, under the guidance of Israel and the US. And Al-Qaeda's job was to create a sectarian war to divide the country while the US was there occupying it. So anyways, the collaboration goes way back, but by the time the US was withdrawing in 2011, they had gathered most of these guys into the prison in Buqa, and they were basically training them there, allowing them to organize. And then once the operation began to topple the Syrian government, or shortly before that, a lot of these guys were released, and then they were sent to Syria. And they were sent there even before the protests erupted. The protests erupted in mid-March in 2011, like amid these other Arab Spring protests, which were also sparked by the US and planned by the US. Those were not grassroots protests in Tunisia. They were not grassroots protests in Egypt or Libya or Yemen. This was all part of a US operation. But anyways, by the time those protests started in Syria, finally in mid-March, which is a little bit after some of those other countries, these Al-Qaeda militants from Iraq that were released from the prisons, they had been gathering in eastern Syria in like Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa areas ever since late 2010. So they were there ready to go. And we know that from an American journalist named Theo Padnos, who was kidnapped in Syria and held by the Nusra Front, Jabhat al-Nusra, again, by the guy who was just shaking hands with Trump, a few weeks ago. That group held this American journalist named Theo Padnos, and he was held for 2 full years by Jabhat al-Nusra. And he was fluent in Arabic, and he just learned a ton of things during his captivity from all the people that he spoke to. And that's what he said, is that these guys were in Syria by late 2010, getting ready to launch the insurgency against Assad. And so again, none of this was as it is described in the media as, the description in the media was, at first there were these grassroots protests, and then the dictator opened fire on his own people. And then that caused people to rebel and become armed and start the insurgency with this democratic Free Syrian Army. But then the Islamists and Al-Qaeda hijacked the revolution, and then they took it in like the wrong direction. That's the narrative, and it's just total nonsense. It was an Islamic Al-Qaeda-led insurgency from the beginning that even was, prepared before the protests even began. And again, even those protests were sparked by US funded activists that had been trained on different technologies and how to start, protests and color revolutions, as they're called. All of this was planned. There's nothing spontaneous about it.
Yeah, it is sometimes hard for people, I guess, to think over that the US would do something like that. But I mean, if you think back in the long scheme of time from now to back in the 80s, where we utilized the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the war. Actually, from Brzezinski said we actually started funding them before the Soviets invaded. But, the big story during the 80s, bin Laden was on our side. He was one of the Saudi financiers there. So we worked with what became Al-Qaeda and bin Laden throughout the 80s. There's also evidence that the US worked with Al-Qaeda in Bosnia and other places around the world. Then we have 9/11, and then we turn on the story goes during Afghanistan and Iraq. But Afghanistan, we seemed a lot more interested in the Taliban than actually fighting Al-Qaeda, and they went over the border into Pakistan. And then we have the Syrian war, where it was this there's no doubt that we utilized Al-Qaida. You have John Kerry also in that leaked recording talking about how we watched ISIS grow. We thought we could manage it and use it as negotiation with Assad. You had Joe Biden in 2016. He did a speech at Harvard where he said, he didn't say the US or Israel, he said Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the UAE basically funded al-Nursra, which he called Al-Qaida. Soon after he apologized to Erdogan and the Emiratis and the UAE.
I think we've been putting an extraordinary amount of arms in, haven't we?
Yeah, and I have to say, as you said, it's a double-edged sword because you give people the ability to defend themselves, but when you pump more weapons into a situation like Syria, it doesn't end well for Syrians because there's always somebody else that's willing to pump more weapons in for the other side. The armed groups in Syria get a lot of support, not just from the United States, but from other partners. And we've never said that
Qatar, Russia, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, huge amount of weapons coming in, huge amount of money.
But pumping weapons in causes someone else to pump more weapons in, and you end up with Aleppo.
I mean, the reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him.
Do you believe that the United States should have acted earlier in Syria, and if not, why is now the right moment?
No. Maybe I can ask that to help.
It's working.
Turn this one on, but I'll use this in the meantime. Is this working? There we go. Okay. The answer is no for two reasons. One, the idea of identifying a moderate middle has been a chase America has been engaged in for a long time. We Americans think in every country in transition, there's a Thomas Jefferson hiding behind some rock or a James Madison beyond one sand dune. The fact of the matter is the ability to identify a moderate middle in Syria there was no moderate middle, because the moderate middle are made up of shopkeepers, not soldiers. They're made up of people who, in fact, were ordinary elements of the middle class of that country. And what happened was, and their history will record this, because I'm finding that former administration officials, as soon as they leave, write books, which I think is inappropriate. But at any rate, no, I'm serious. I do think it's inappropriate. At least, give the guy a chance to get out of office. What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nursra and Al-Qaida and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaida in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nursra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened?
And then up to now, we have HTS, we have al-Julani. So basically, you have to imagine that in that small period, we wasn't using them. So it is hard not to be conspiratorial and just wonder, has Al-Qaeda always been under the US thumb, or Israel, what the role there is? Do we lean on the Saudis and other countries during, obviously, the start of the Syrian war? So yeah, so
Yeah.
I take it. Sorry.
Oh, and so to comment on that, I mean, again, one indication of this cooperation is we saw just barely when Julani was in New York, he sat down for a conversation with David Petraeus, the former CIA director who oversaw this whole operation, Timber Sycamore, to arm and fund Al-Qaeda to overthrow Assad. But Petraeus, the relationship between Petraeus and Julani goes back, way more. So Petraeus was the U.S. general that oversaw Mosul after the U.S. invasion, shortly after 2003. And that was where, in Mosul was where Julani, got his start after he got released from Bucca prison. Probably in 2009, he traveled to Mosul and was the emir of the Islamic State in Mosul. And the Kurds, this is the next book I'm working on. I'll write about this, but the Kurds, Masoud Barzani, the close ally of the US and Israel, his Kurdistan Democratic Party, they controlled Al-Qaeda in Mosul. And there was even a Kurdish politician very high up in Masoud Barzani's party. His name was Khosrow Ghorani. He was in charge of the Al-Qaeda cells in Mosul during the time that, Julani was the emir there. So that relationship between even David Petraeus and Julani, goes back to that time. And when they sat down together in New York, just barely, you could see that they'd been friends for like a long time. And David Petraeus was so excited to see him. He was just smiling and acted like really a proud father, that he was like looking at the guy that he had mentored for many, many years. And David Petraeus even publicly wrote, some op-eds in newspapers, back during the Syria war, 2015, if I remember correctly, arguing that the U.S. should partner with Al-Qaeda. He was making that argument back then. So that's the Iraq links. But, going back, like you said, that's good to point back to the period of Afghanistan. I mean, the U.S. first supported, along with the Saudis and the Pakistanis, supported the Mujahideen that fought in Afghanistan way back in the 80s. And then a lot of those Mujahideen that fought in Afghanistan, they were actually Kurdish. And so when they came back to the northern Iraq after fighting in Afghanistan and developing these links with Al-Qaeda and developing these links with the CIA, they came back to Kurdistan, and then they were the ones, they started getting support from Masoud Barzani, and they were the ones that actually formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi was an Arab released from a prison in Jordan and became the face of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but it was initially a Kurdish organization, all of guys who had fought for the CIA in Afghanistan and who were on Masoud Barzani's payroll, in 2001, 2002, 2003, when the US invaded. So again, the roots of Al-Qaeda in Iraq are from Kurds that had relationships with the US intelligence and with Israel and with Masoud Barzani specifically. And again, for people who might have remembered 9/11, I remember I was in college and I remember seeing the second plane hit. And that just cemented in our minds so strongly that Al-Qaeda and the US were enemies, seeing those planes hit. And the propaganda was so extensive that was like, who could have imagined that really Al-Qaeda was created by the US or created by Israel? It took me a long time to wrap my brain around that and to kind of realize it. But if you think about it, again, the US supported Al-Qaeda type groups in Afghanistan in the 80s. Then the US supported Al-Qaeda groups fighting in Chechnya against the Russians in the 90s. They supported Al-Qaeda groups fighting in Bosnia in the 90s. They supported Al-Qaeda groups fighting in Kosovo in the 90s. And then 9/11 hits, and we are supposed to imagine that Al-Qaeda was our enemy. Okay, even if you assume that's the case. Then all of a sudden, the U.S. was supporting Al-Qaida in Iraq, and then the U.S. was supporting Al-Qaida groups in Syria. So that the history of cooperation, it goes way back. So whatever your view on 9/11 is, even if you think that 9/11, was not an inside job and that Al-Qaida really did do it, still the U.S. supported Al-Qaida in all of these other instances. So it shouldn't be shocking to believe that they supported them in Syria. And again, just seeing Julani walk into New York and see the type of the red carpet that he received. I mean, there's no way that the U.S. government really believed that the war on terror that it launched, back in 2001 was real if they spent that much money and killed that many people supposedly to eliminate Al-Qaida and to eliminate terrorism. And then they just welcome one of the most notorious Al-Qaida terrorists into the United States, not that many years later, and roll out the red carpet for them. It just shows that, this was Al-Qaida was a U.S. and an Israeli operation from the beginning,
Yeah, the whole HTS Trump handshake, New York, it really just blows that narrative out of the water, to be honest. The war on terror was always a bit of a joke because in Afghanistan, we go to fight Al-Qaida, and then we just focus on the Taliban, and then we go to Iraq, and then you have Libya and Syria and all these wars. And Assad was, he's a dictator. His dad was a dictator before that, but he was, fairly secular. He wore a suit. You hear a lot of people talking about where have all the Christians gone in the Middle East, and at least Assad, he didn't target just random minorities, unlike the HTS regime now with the Alawites and other groups that we're just kind of ignoring. So it really does blow the narrative about, everything is about fighting the terrorists there. It's just constantly, excuse, just like the excuse of fighting ISIS in Syria to stay in that the hydrocarbons area. What was it, Dana Stroll, where she's at some like think tank, and there's like a clip before where it's her talking in Congress or the Senate about, we need to be there to fight ISIS and, to stop Iran's influence. And then she's at this think tank and she's like, this is full of hydrocarbons. It's where the wheat comes from. We can stop reconstruction. We can block embassies. And it's just nothing to do with fighting terrorists.
We argued in our recommendation section that taken as a whole, even though the United States, that there's limited appetite domestically here or on the Hill to match the level of resources or even diplomatic investment of the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, that the United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East, is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. and there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria. So,
an excuse. So it is really surreal to see this happening today. And just going back to the prison story, there's quite a few good articles about it where all the terrorists were mixing together, and then there's the bit where they're writing each other's phone numbers on their pants, like a waistline, so when they get out they can all get back together. It was Jihadi University, I think, was a terror factory, and all these different names for it. It is bizarre. But going back to the Syrian part of the story with the war, just how active do you think the US was actually supporting them? Because again, there's constant articles about, so you have the Free Syrian Army, the moderate rebels, which we can train and give weapons to. And there's endless articles talking about how they're changing sides to Al-Qaida or ISIS, or Al-Qaida and ISIS are taking the weapons because they're the stronger group. And as you said, we knew from the start there was the stronger group. There's that 2012 DIA memo, is it Michael Flynn? Where it talks about how, from the start, the strongest groups were Al-Qaida, and they were supported by Turkey and the Gulf nations. So we knew this from the start. So leading up to, I guess, HTS now, where it's clear we completely allied with them. You have, was it Jim Jeffries, the Turkish ambassador, talking about how we had indirect, contact with them for years. The MI6 now, MI6 head, he said how they'd made contact a few years ago. And during the actual coup, the US helped coordinate, groups with them. But going back to, I guess, the early stages, just how involved do you think the US actually was? Because there's a lot of stories where it's like, we lean on the Saudis or the Qataris or Turkey to kind of do the dirty work financing, and the US will have more of a different sort of role. How do you kind of see the different countries working together in this kind of scenario?
Well, that's one thing that's really apparent from everything I learned from writing the book, was that these different intelligence agencies, they really work extremely closely together. Some people describe that as, they would use the phrase the Safari Club to kind of describe the type of cooperation that takes place between the different intelligence agencies. And they in many ways operate as one unit, but with the US and Israel kind of at the head of the snake.
So you just referenced there the Safari Club with different intelligence agencies, how they work. Just actually, while you mentioned that, what are you referring to there? Just so the audience knows the reference to the Safari Club.
Well, if I remember right, it was back during in the 80s, of the period of the Iran-Contra scandal. This group of intelligence agencies like the US, Israel, Saudi, France, if I remember, they kind of gained the nickname of the Safari Club. And again, it just kind of denotes that these groups, they just work, really close together, and they kind of form like a mafia, essentially. And so you saw that in the case of the Syria war, where there was British intelligence participating very closely, Saudi intelligence, Israeli intelligence, obviously, Qatari. So the US and Israel, they would kind of outsource tasks. They would go to the Saudis and say, hey, can you provide a bunch of money for this operation that we're trying to do? Or hey, to the Saudis, can you gather a bunch of radical fighters and send them, to Syria to fight? Talk, the same thing from the Qataris, the same thing from the Turks. So, but again, in the book, I talk about the planning that went on from the U.S. side, And it was really evident from what was called Presidential Study Directive 11, which was a document issued by the Obama administration in late 2010. And Obama had gathered together representatives of the CIA, the State Department, and even tech companies, the National Security Council. And they basically planned to spark the Arab Spring. And the idea was that they were going to bring, basically topple these old dictatorships, including the ones that were already allied with the US, like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and that they were going to replace them with more democratic or popular governments led by the Muslim Brotherhood. So the objective and their intentions were laid out very clearly in Presidential Study Directive 11, and it's not a conspiracy theory. The New York Times, the Washington Post reported about it. And again, I detail it in my book. And just as they said they were going to topple these different Arab governments and replace them with the Muslim Brotherhood, that's what we saw efforts, that's what we saw essentially happen in all the Arab Spring countries, although it took longer in some places than others, was more successful in some places than others. Also, that effort involved using a lot of false flag snipers, just like the US employed in Ukraine during the Maidan protests in 2014. In all the different Arab Spring countries, there were false flag snipers that helped spark the population's anger against the existing rulers and give Obama the justification to call for these rulers to step down from power. But again, this was a US and by extension an Israeli-led project. But again, they would just subcontract some of the jobs to these different intelligence agencies that work closely with them. And I should say, the British role was really, really strong. It's kind of under appreciated. And in all those previous examples that I mentioned, like Chechnya, Bosnia, Kosovo, the British intelligence, Libya, British intelligence sent a bunch of young British guys of Muslim background to go fight. And when it came to Syria, they sent a ton of guys. There was a group called the al-Muhajirin, kind of a Salafist activist group in the UK that used to recruit young guys and send them over to all these different countries, including to Syria. So there was a really strong representation within ISIS of young British guys that grew up in London, that grew up in Manchester. And for decades, going back to the 80s, London was like a haven for a lot of these like Islamists that the US and the UK were using to destabilize and topple different governments. Osama bin Laden used to have an office in London. He almost bought a home there. They refer to it as Londonistan, was kind of the common phrase to refer to all this Islamist activity in London. So again, but all these intelligence agencies work together, and he also saw that really clearly with the 2013 false flag chemical attack in the suburbs of Damascus, where all these intelligence agencies again worked very closely to to pull that off. If you like, we could talk about that, or again, maybe you want to transition to what's been happening in the last year, but. It's pretty amazing the amount of money and coordination that went into the whole Syria regime change operation. But again, if you said this back in 2012, 13, 14, or 15, when I started writing about it, you were considered a crazy conspiracy theorist. But again, all the documentation about it, the CIA and other intelligence agency planning for this, it's all in my book. So.
Yeah, no, feel free to talk about the chemical attack. I think that's important. But just what you were referring there, have you read, I'm guessing you have, but it sounds like you have, Mark Curtis's book about Britain's role with radical Islam through British Empire up to now? Is that what some of you was kind of referencing there?
Yeah, Mark Curtis documents a lot of this. The only maybe critique I would have of Mark is that he tends to argue that a lot of this was kind of unintentional by the UK government. Like he kind of almost suggests like it's an accident at times, whereas I would say no, it's very deliberate. I mean, even the Muslim Brotherhood has been a tool UK intelligence for more than 50 years. So the relationship between the UK and these radical Islamic groups is really strong. But Mark Curtis's book is really great, and yeah, that's where a lot of this information comes from. So if people are interested in that, I would certainly recommend they read his book.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's probably held back maybe more with the Syrian war, with saying we directly work with Al-Qaida. You could probably argue before that, up to that, he's pretty clear we worked with like the Mujahideen and other groups in the 90s, but maybe post 9/11, that's where he probably softens up. Maybe now you start asking about it with Julani in power, he might have give you a different answer. But feel free to talk about the 2013 chemical weapons attack and any others, around, because there was the Duma attack in 2018, and was there a third one before that, if I'm correct? But yeah, feel free to talk about them. It's an important story because even on the face of it, it's just kind of bizarre because Obama, did that speech about our red line would be Assad using chemical weapons. And you're Assad, you don't want to get overthrown. You've seen what's happened to Gaddafi in Libya being sodomized to death after being overthrown by NATO. And you just go, you know what, I'm going to just do a chemical weapon attack, make sure the US invades and gets troops. It just makes no sense. Like, I think there was a senator who was on, was it CNN or MSNBC, where she's asking about it, and he's like, I just don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. Why would Assad do this when the US said, if you do this, we will come? And he's like, it's just that crazy. Like, it's just such a ridiculous story. But yeah, please tell people about it in the background.
It's hard to know exactly what's happening in Syria right now. I'd like to know specifically how that release of chemical gas, if it did occur, and it looks like it did, how that occurred. Because frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It does not serve his interests. It would tend to draw us into that civil war even further.
Who do you think is behind it? Who do you think is behind it?
You've got a war going on over there. Supposedly that airstrike was on an ammo dump, and so I don't know if it was released because there was gas stored in the ammo dump or not. That's plausible. I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but
you're more inclined to believe the position of what Bashar al-Assad is saying and what the Russians are saying right now than more inclined to believe what even your colleagues here in the United States believe is truth, that this is Assad, and what human rights observers over there say is Assad?
I don't think it would have served Assad's purposes to do a chemical attack on his people. So it's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did.
Congressman Tom Massey, thanks for your time.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And so basically what happened is, again, the U.S. is funding these Al-Qaida and arming these Al-Qaida groups to topple the Syrian government. And by May of 2013, it wasn't going that well. There was a really important town near the Lebanese border called Covert. And that was where, from Lebanon through Covert, was where the Free Syrian Army and Jabhat al-Nursra were getting a lot of their weapons. So a lot of the weapons were being sent by these different intelligence agencies from Lebanon. And again, the path to get them to Homs, which is one of the major, cities where the important cities where fighting was going on, was through this town, Covert. And in May of 2013, Hezbollah managed to take that town from the different so-called rebel groups. And that was just a big blow to the US and Israel's effort to topple Assad. And it was just looking like he was going to win the war. And Assad was also making progress against the different Islamic extremist groups that were in the suburbs of Damascus, like Jaish al-Islam was one. And so you see that they ended up launching this false flag chemical attack. But the origins of that go back a little bit further, about a year before, to the summer of 2012. And as you mentioned, Obama gave this speech where he said, if Assad were to use chemical weapons in the conflict, this will be a red line for us. And that would cause us to Essentially, he says that would cause the US to intervene against Assad if he used chemical weapons. And it turns out it was actually the Israelis who first kind of coined the term the red line and started using that phrase. And Hillary Clinton picked it up and started using it. And then finally, Obama mentioned it in a speech. So as you mentioned, that just essentially opened the door for not only the Al-Qaida groups to try to do a false flag attack, blame it on Assad, and then suddenly get the US Air Force on their side in the conflict. But it also opened the door for the US and other intelligence agencies to do a false flag attack and get Obama to employ the Air Force on the side of the Al-Qaida groups in order to accomplish the goal of regime change. And so from August 2012 until, for the next year, until the big false flag chemical attack occurred in Ghouta in the Damascus suburbs in August 2013, there was a series of smaller, basically fake or false flag chemical attacks that when you study closely, you can see that these were just manufactured again by intelligence agencies. The French were involved, the British were involved, the Saudis were involved. And then finally we get the big one. The smaller ones that built up to it, that kind of set the narrative that, oh, look, Assad is using chemical weapons. And look, he's crossing Obama's red line. And then finally you get this big one in August of 2013 where supposedly 1,400 people died. Suddenly on the morning of August 21st, there are all these videos that are uploaded to the internet and then spread on Al Jazeera and CNN, showing hundreds of bodies of dead people, women, children, men, with the claim that Assad had done this chemical attack. And again, it was just ridiculous. Like you said, Assad knew very clearly that if I do a chemical attack, this is going to lead to my government being overthrown. And again, as you mentioned, would lead to him getting probably murdered in the streets and sodomized like Gaddafi was. So it just didn't make any sense. And even a major U.S. general, Dempsey, I forget his first name, he stated about 6 months before that, hey, look, the Syrians know that if they use chemical weapons, that this is a red line and this is sufficient to deter them from doing that. He basically said, look, everyone understands it's not in Assad's interest to do this. Just us saying that there's a red line is enough for him not to do it. But again, it didn't make any sense. But when the attack happened and all these videos come out and there's all these dead people, it just creates the impression in people's mind that, oh, like whatever the narrative is initially, whatever they're being told on the news is what just stays in their head. And so it just takes a lot of effort to debunk all the propaganda and show, that it's wrong. But the first impression that's spread by the mass media is what stays in people's minds. And so, even to this day, of course, most people think that Assad did that chemical attack. But when Obama ended up getting cold feet, he was thinking back on the Iraq War, how it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction, and George Bush got blamed for that and took the fall, even though that war was really pushed by Jewish neoconservatives in his administration. He was just kind of the front man. But Bush took the blame once things didn't go well in the Iraq War, and Obama felt like, hey, this is risky for me, and so he backed off. And there was no major U.S. intervention, but Obama then green-lighted additional weapons being sent to these jihadist Al-Qaeda groups, and he greenlit more and more fighters being sent from places like Tunisia and from Europe, from the UK, from Belgium, from France, from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, to flood into Syria and continue the war for several more years.
Yeah, no, it does just incentivize other groups to do it. I mean, it's not crazy to think, oh, here's some crazy Al-Qaeda fighters or rebels. They want the support of the world superpower who has an air force. Their president's just said, if this happens, they'll come in. If we do it, there's no way the people in the US who want to intervene are going to blame us. So it's like a foolproof plan of like, let's just do a false flag attack. Assad will get blamed naturally because that's the way the narrative will work. It's not crazy to think that at all. Even if you thought no intelligence agencies had any role, just some rebels want to do that. You could make that argument if you just want to claim that clearly Assad wouldn't be stupid enough to do that. You've mentioned obviously Israel a few times, just to give people an idea, what was their role within the war? Because a lot of the times, they will lean on the US, like you mentioned, the neoconservatives around Bush, very close to Israel. And the Iraq War, part of that, was in Israel's interest. If you go back to the clean break, written up for Benjamin Netanyahu in '96 by Richard Pearl and is it David Froome, who wrote that up about remaking the Middle East, knocking out Syria and Iraq. So leading up to the Syrian war and during the Syrian war, what was Israel's role? Because I know the US, does a lot of the heavy lifting, and they want to stop the weapons coming through from Iran to Hezbollah, and Assad was Iran's ally. So that's kind of their main motivation. But what was Israel's part? How, what did they actually do themselves throughout kind of the conflict?
Well, yeah, I would like to emphasize that really all of this was done for Israel's behalf. And, sometimes it's hard to separate what is the U.S. or even to talk about the U.S. and Israel as different entities, because U.S. foreign policy is controlled by Zionists, mostly Jewish Zionists in the U.S. Again, a lot of times we call them neoconservatives, but at the end of the day, they're Jewish Zionists. They're the ones that control U.S. policy, and that's become, more clear since the Gaza genocide started. Even Biden was kind of dragging his feet in ways in terms of supporting the genocide. But at the end of the day, people like Tony Blinken, who's Jewish, he's probably Israeli. Just kept the weapons going, and there was, the Israelis, they get their way. So it was the same thing regarding the war in Syria. You mentioned the clean break document that was drafted by, again, David Wormser and the others. And the idea was, to knock out Syria, to knock out Iraq, and to divide them up into like small, weak ethnic enclaves, so that there could never be a strong Arab army that could challenge Israel. So again, what the U.S. does versus what Israel does, it's kind of hard to distinguish at times. But specifically, the Israelis, they were providing direct support to Jabhat al-Nursra, to Julani's group, the Al-Qaida group, and that's been documented in the Israeli press and by the Wall Street Journal. They talked about the Israelis giving weapons directly to the Nusra that was fighting on the other side of its border in southern Syria. They would allow Nusra fighters to cross into Israel to get treatment at Israeli hospitals. And again, they were sending in weapons, and they were providing funding, paying salaries. And the other thing is, with Israel, they stay quiet about things. So they do a lot of things, but they stay quiet about it. And there's a couple comments that I found from Israeli officials where they basically said, look, it's not to our advantage to talk about the things that we do in terms of supporting the rebels, the so-called rebels in Syria. It's not good for the so-called rebels to be seen as agents of Israel, and it's not good for Israel to be seen as supporting the rebels. It's better for Israel's role to be quiet. And from the beginning of the war, the Israelis in the Israeli media, they used to print stories that would say things like, well, we don't know about this uprising because, Assad he's our enemy, but he's like the devil we know. And the border between Israel and Syria has been quiet. So we just feel like it's better if Assad stays in power. That was like lots of reports in the Israeli media about that. And that's the kind of the message that they wanted to give. But eventually they ended up admitting And again, I document a lot of this in my book, especially after the chemical attack in 2013. A lot of Israeli officials ended up admitting, and they're like, well, yeah, actually, we wanted to overthrow Assad from the very beginning. And again, they supported all these Al-Qaida groups. And Netanyahu was very open about that back in December, on the very day that Julani took power in Damascus. Netanyahu went to the border of Syria and the Golan Heights because the Israeli army quickly moved in and occupied a bunch of extra territory. And Netanyahu made clear that he was responsible for Assad falling. And then he later gave an interview saying that he had warned the Iranians not to send any planes full of fighters and weapons to help Assad, as Julani and his group, by then known as HTS, was trying to take Damascus. So the Israelis are extremely proud of their role in toppling Assad. And again, initially in the war, they claimed, oh, we would like Assad to stay because he's the devil we know. But later they made it clear that they were behind, the policy to topple him. But again, they're using the U.S. as their tool. They're using the Saudis as their tool. They're using the Qataris as their tool. One way I think that's good to think of it, and this is a little bit controversial. Some people there argue, there's this argument like, well, who controls who, the U.S. or Israel? Does the U.S. control Israel, or does Israel control the U.S.? But again, because there are Jewish Zionists that largely run U.S. foreign policy, whether they're Israelis or not, this doesn't make that much sense to differentiate between the two countries. But even if you do, there's an Iranian general who said it in a way that I think is good. He said, from the Iranian perspective, America is the great Satan and Israel is the small Satan. But a lot of the time, the small Satan crawls into the brain of the big Satan and tells the big Satan what to do. So I just think that from what I've learned over all these years, that's probably the best way to briefly articulate who's really running the show. It's the Israelis or the Jewish Zionists in the United States that work in tandem with them. And so that's really important to remember. All of this, all the death, all the murder, all the killing, was planned by the Zionists. It was executed by the Zionists for their benefit. And, Bashar al-Assad, his army, they did a lot of bad things too. In any war, you get atrocities on both sides. So it's not that Assad never did anything wrong or his army didn't commit any crimes. But all of this was initiated by the Israelis and the Americans. And it's just sad because Syria, before the war, I've talked to hundreds of Syrians about this at this point, and every single one I've talked to, even people who hate it, came back in. But
yeah, no, it just you started lagging a lot, and I couldn't hear you. I don't know if it was my end or your end. So you're just in the middle of saying that every Syrian you'd spoken to before the war, then it started cutting out.
Yeah, every Syrian that I spoke to before the war said that it was a good country. People had good lives. There was no political freedom, that's for sure. You couldn't criticize the president. But that's the case in all the Arab countries. You can't talk about the president or the king, or you're in big trouble. It was that way in Syria, but at the same time, people had good lives. The economy was good. Syria does not have a huge population, and they have a lot of their own natural resources. They can produce their own food. They have enough oil to supply the country's needs. It was secure. You could drive all the way across the country without any checkpoints. It was safe to be out in the middle of the night, to be walking in the cities at 2, 3 a.m. People could get a job and afford a car and afford a home, and they could afford to get married. And, things were going very well. And just as things were really improving and going in an extremely positive direction, including, for example, regarding political prisoners and things like this, like many political prisoners had been released in 2010. The numbers of people who were in prison for political reasons was very low. Most of those were Salafists, who had links to these radical groups. But the situation was just very good. And so right at that moment is when Israel and the US decided to overthrow Syria, again, because of its anti-Israel foreign policy, and also probably because of Assad's refusal to allow some pipelines, Qatari pipelines, to go through the country. But then the war that they sparked and all the atrocities that the so-called rebels committed, like ISIS, Nusra, the Free Army, and then even the atrocities that, you know, would have been committed by the Syrian army too during the course of the war, all of that could have been avoided if the US and Israel had not tried to destabilize a good, you know, prospering country. And again, probably 500,000 people died in the war. You know, huge numbers killed by both sides, huge numbers died on both sides, millions of refugees, all of the destruction. It was all because of the US and Israel. And it's just really tragic to think back about, just like it's tragic to think back on all the people killed in Iraq. You know, the Iraq War was launched and initiated on it for Israel's benefit and on Israel's behalf. And there's hundreds of thousands of Iraqis that died as a result. So again, it's just very sad to think about the results of these really horrific, sinister policies that were launched against all of these different Middle Eastern countries.
Just to talk about some of the different groups before we get to like HTS and the current situation with like ISIS, al-Nursra, there was a lot, and then there was lots of different rebranding and different groups. I mean, how much do you think of that is like a Western narrative that we need to name the group, or, you know, is it on the ground? Is it that situation? Because they're constantly, you know, switching groups. They're very similar, I guess, to their ideas. And you had ISIS split off from Al-Qaida. And then you have now, you know, we're working with al-Julani and al-Nursra to fight ISIS. And you referenced earlier, Petraeus, he wrote that article where he said we should support Al-Qaida against ISIS. You know, how much of this actually has any reality base between the groups compared to just kind of narrative? Because we seem to lean eventually more towards al-Nursra. We did bomb ISIS eventually, although, as I mentioned earlier, John Kerry said we watched them grow. We thought we could use them as leverage, and other groups also, you know, countries funded them as well. So how do you kind of see the differences there?
Well, you know, they do end up being different groups, but it's the essence of them was often no different. And the US would portray them in different ways for different purposes. So the Free Syrian Army was basically made up of Salafists that were sectarian killers. But they were portrayed as moderate because we wanted to give them weapons, which we knew would immediately be sold or passed on to the Al-Qaida groups, the explicitly Al-Qaida groups like Nusra. But then later it was to the US's advantage to kind of rehabilitate Nusra, rebrand it, and make it seem like not so radical, not so extreme. And again, MI6 and Jonathan Powell and the Qataris were very instrumental in rebranding Nusra once they took over Idlib. I mean, they took over Idlib largely due to the help of CIA supplied TOW missiles in 2015. But then with ISIS, ISIS was not much different. Obviously, it was a split off of Nusra, where they were like sister organizations. But for ISIS, the US marketed them in a different way because there was a different use. You know, ISIS ended up taking control of these areas in eastern Syria and then western Iraq. And the US wanted an excuse to go in, send troops, or use airstrikes and partner with Kurdish forces, whether from the PKK in Syria or from Masoud Barzani's Kurdistan Democratic Party in Iraq. They wanted ISIS to spread in those areas, and they helped them spread. In fact, all the weapons that ISIS used to take over Mosul, I wrote an article about this for the Cradle. All the weapons that ISIS used to take over Mosul were American weapons, purchased by the Americans in Eastern Europe and then sent by the Saudis to Jordan and then later sent to ISIS, and they were used in the attack on Mosul. And Mosul fell because Kurdish generals and officers in the Iraqi army that were loyal to Masoud Barzani basically withdrew from the city and opened the doors and let ISIS come right in. But the U.S. there wanted to portray ISIS as really evil and bad in order to give the excuse for the U.S. and then their Kurdish allies to then retake or reconquer these areas from ISIS and then occupy them permanently. So you'll notice that the entire area that ISIS occupied in eastern Syria and western Iraq, those areas were later taken over by the Kurds with U.S. help. And it's not viewed as conquest. It's not viewed as stealing land like from Arabs or Christians in eastern Syria or from Yazidis in Sinjar in western Iraq. It's viewed as liberating the area. And then it's just a way to basically consolidate Kurdish control over those areas. And by extension, that means Israeli and U.S. control. So there are just all these different games that are played. And so sometimes it's to the U.S.'s benefit to like demonize some of the groups like ISIS so they can directly intervene with the Kurds and take that territory from them. But in the case of Nusra, it was in our interest to make them look more moderate and do some good PR to rebrand them. But the essence of the groups is the same. These are mercenaries with like extremist Islamic ideology that calls for killing Alawites. Subjugating Christians, killing Druze because they're non-believers, because they're apostates. So all these groups are really nasty, but they're branded in different ways for whatever reason the U.S. needs.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the rebranding now with Julani, but even before that, he did that interview with PBS. He started trimming his beard, wearing a suit. The whole thing just feels completely manufactured, and now you can see it is. And you have Turkey's role, Israel's role, the US, and the UK. You mentioned Powell there, who used to work under Tony Blair, and Tony Blair interviewed the foreign minister for Julani at the World Economic Forum, and there was like an indirect link of MI6 that led the road for David Lammy and the UK government to go over there and normalize and give money. All very strange. I only have about 5 minutes left. I'd love to have you on again, maybe another time down the line once you've done a few more interviews and written your articles, to focus on HTS and kind of how you see it now, just because I do have to jump off myself after this. But any closing thoughts just about Syria, the war, anything you want to relay to people, or about your book? That would be great.
Well, I guess the final thing is to mention briefly what's happened since then. When Julani took power in December, that was kind of the first step. And the second step is to finish the Israeli plan that was outlined in the Clean Break paper, which is to divide Syria into ethnic or religious enclaves that again will be weak and will never have a big army that can threaten Israel. So that's what's been happening since Julani took power. It's clear to me, and I'm doing some writing about this now, that the major massacres that took place in March against the Alawites, where Julani's forces descended on the Syrian coast and massacred at least 1,500 Alawite civilians. And then also the massacres that took place in Sueda in July, where Julani's guys descended on Sueda and went home to home, murdering people. These massacres were orchestrated by Israel, and the purpose is to create, sectarian violence and hatred between these different groups, so that they all want their own autonomous region, just like the Kurds already have in the Northeast. The Israelis want to make sure that the Druze are scared to death of Julani's killers, and so they say, "Oh, Israel, please help us. Now we want to have our own, country or autonomous region in the south," to scare it to death and terrorize the Alawites, so that they go to either Israel or the U.S. or to Russia for help in order to again make that an autonomous region that will continue to divide Syria and make sure it's never a strong country again. So Israel's kind of currently in the process of stage 2 of the operation, which is to go ahead and divide Syria into these different ethnic areas. So that's the thing to keep your eye on, is that the Israelis are still active, creating sectarian violence between these groups. And again, this is all predictable based on understanding the nature of the protests that first erupted in 2011 and the US and Israeli-backed Al-Qaida-led insurgency that accompanied them. So I guess that's it. And again, if you would like the details about that early period, again, it's all in my book, Creative Chaos. And if someone really wants the details, I think they would enjoy the book.
Yeah, I actually have your book. I left it at work, otherwise I could have held it up. But I'll put it on the screen, and I will put it in the. I'll try and get as many show notes as I can from what we've talked about. But I'll put your book in it. But I really appreciate you coming on. I'd love to have you on again to go into more detail about Israel's kind of step 2 agenda. I mean, they're clearly taking more land and using it to justifying it, and with the Druze as well. And it'd just be interesting to see your thoughts how that's going to play out, I guess, with the Gulf nations, and how you see the US relationship with them trying to normalize, and is it a clash, is it not?